The grandeur of the Supreme Court's marble hallways had never felt so suffocating to Usha Vance. A seasoned attorney and intellectual powerhouse and the wife of Vice President J.D. Vance, she had always known the law inside and out. But today she wasn't here as a legal strategist. Today she stood on the other side of justice. "Mrs. Vance, your presence is required in courtroom 3, a clerk informed her, eyes hesitant as though he couldn't believe the words he was saying. Usha's sharp mind quickly assessed the situation. There had been no prior notice, no official complaint, yet here she was, summoned before a federal judge. She had argued in some of the highest courts in the land, but never had she been a defendant. The situation was absurd, but she knew better than to show any sign of unease. She walked into the courtroom with the composed elegance of someone who had fought legal battles her entire life. The room was filled with reporters, their pens ready, cameras clicking. Something bigger was at play. At the bench sat Judge Lionel Carter, a formidable figure in American jurisprudence. Known for his sharp wit and unconventional rulings, he had the rare ability to make even the most seasoned attorneys second-guess themselves. Usha stood before him, hands clasped, her mind racing to decipher the chess game she had unknowingly stepped into. "Mrs. Vance," Judge Carter began, his voice resonating across the chamber, "you have been found in violation of Article 14, Section 3 of the Judicial Ethics Code, which, as you are well aware, pertains to the undue influence of legal professionals in matters of public interest." Usha raised an eyebrow, her courtroom instincts kicking in. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I am unaware of any such violation. I would appreciate some clarity on the charges." The judge nodded. "You are being fined $50,000 for this offense." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Usha remained still, absorbing the information. A fine? Without a trial? Without even a proper accusation? She exhaled softly. "May I ask on what basis this penalty has been imposed, Your Honor?" Judge Carter smirked. "That, Mrs. Vance, is precisely why you're here. Consider this a legal test of your genius. Your ability to challenge this ruling, your defense against my fine, will determine whether you truly deserve the reputation you hold in this nation's legal circles." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The judge had essentially declared this a game, a challenge to Usha Vance's intellect and skill. Usha tilted her head, studying him. This wasn't an act of malice. It was an invitation. "Very well, Your Honor," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "Let's play." The courtroom remained silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. This was not a typical legal proceeding, it was a challenge, a high-stakes test of legal prowess designed to push Usha Vance to her limits. And she welcomed it. Judge Lionel Carter leaned forward, tapping his gavel lightly. "Mrs. Vance, you may begin your defense. The floor is yours." Usha took a steady breath. If this was truly a test, she would have to treat it as such, one where the opponent was not just the judge but the very fabric of legal interpretation itself. She turned to the assembled press, fully aware that the entire nation would be watching. Then, with deliberate poise, she spoke. "Your Honor, I challenge this fine on two fundamental grounds, procedural due process and judicial overreach." A few reporters scribbled furiously while others watched, captivated. "First," she continued, "procedural due process, as enshrined in the 5th and 14th Amendments, dictates that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Yet here I stand, accused and sentenced in a single breath, without a trial, without a hearing, and without a clear articulation of the alleged violation. This ruling is, therefore, unconstitutional on its face." Judge Carter gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to proceed. "Second, judicial overreach," Usha pressed on. "This court has imposed a fine upon a private citizen without precedent, jurisdiction, or a substantiated complaint. Your Honor has essentially assumed the role of prosecutor, jury, and executioner, violating the principle of separation of powers that our Constitution so carefully upholds." A murmur ran through the room. She was methodically dismantling the very foundation of the fine. Judge Carter remained impassive. "A well-argued position, Mrs. Vance. However, I must remind you that the Judicial Ethics Code, which you yourself have upheld as an attorney, grants judges discretionary authority in certain matters of legal integrity. Would you deny that this discretion exists?" Usha gave a knowing smile. "Judicial discretion exists, Your Honor, but it is not absolute. It must be exercised within the limits of constitutional safeguards. The moment it crosses into arbitrary punishment, such as this fine, it ceases to be discretion and becomes tyranny. And that, Your Honor, is something neither this court nor this nation will stand for." The room erupted in whispers. The press had their headlines. Judge Carter leaned back, a glint of approval flashing in his eyes. A compelling argument. But tell me, Mrs. Vance, if the fine were, in fact, imposed to uphold legal integrity rather than punish, would your position change? Usha didn't hesitate. No, Your Honor. Because the law is not a game of hypotheticals, it is a structure of precedents. And precedent dictates that any action taken by this court must be lawful, fair, and subject to review. Judge Carter folded his hands, his demeanor shifting from the weight of authority to the sharp gaze of a seasoned legal tactician. This was no longer a hearing, it was a duel fought not with swords but with statutes and precedents. Mrs. Vance, your argument hinges on the idea that my ruling was an arbitrary exercise of judicial power. However, I challenge you with this: can a judge not issue a summary penalty when the integrity of the legal system is at stake? Usha's mind immediately ran through case law. Judge Carter was testing a well-worn but dangerous legal doctrine, one that blurred the lines between maintaining judicial authority and violating due process. You refer, perhaps, to the precedent set in Ex parte 1888, Usha said, her voice steady, where the Supreme Court upheld a judge's power to summarily punish contemptuous behavior to maintain order in court. The judge nodded. Exactly. The court has long held that a judge may exercise immediate enforcement measures without a formal trial in matters of legal integrity. Would you argue against this principle? Usha resisted a smirk. He was leading her into a trap, one that many lesser attorneys might have fallen into. But she wasn't just any attorney. With respect, Your Honor, you are drawing a false equivalency, she said smoothly. Ex parte applies to contempt of court, direct actions that disrupt proceedings and obstruct justice. But in my case, there has been no disruption, no contempt. The fine imposed upon me is not a measure of maintaining order but rather a punitive action without an articulated offense. She took a step forward, letting the weight of her words sink in. The real precedent that applies here is Bloom v. Illinois, 1968, where the Supreme Court ruled that criminal contempt charges require the full protections of a jury trial if they result in serious penalties. A $50,000 fine certainly qualifies as serious. Judge Carter's eyes flickered with something resembling admiration. She had just blocked his move with a precedent even stronger than his own. The courtroom buzzed with excitement. The case was no longer just a spectacle, it was an intellectual war, and Usha was proving herself a formidable opponent. The judge sat back, folding his arms. An excellent rebuttal, Mrs. Vance. But tell me, if I were to argue that this fine is a civil rather than criminal penalty, would your position still hold? Usha immediately saw where he was going. He was shifting the argument's framing, trying to sidestep her constitutional protections by calling the fine civil rather than criminal. She smiled. Your Honor, if you were to make that claim, you would then have to prove that my alleged violation caused actual harm to another party, as civil penalties require damages or injury. In this case, no injured party exists. Therefore, by definition, this fine cannot be civil. The room fell silent. Usha had just shut down every possible avenue the judge could use to justify the fine. Judge Carter exhaled. Then, much to everyone's shock, he laughed. A deep, satisfied chuckle. Well argued, Mrs. Vance. Well argued indeed. Then he leaned forward, eyes gleaming. But I'm not done yet. The duel was far from over. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law, it had transformed into an intellectual battlefield where every word carried the weight of history. The world was watching, and Usha Vance knew that one wrong move could unravel everything she had built. Judge Lionel Carter tapped his gavel lightly, his smirk revealing that he still had one more card to play. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice steady. You have dismantled my argument well. However, let us consider the legal doctrine of judicial review. As established in Marbury v. Madison, 1803, the courts have the authority to interpret laws and determine the limits of judicial power. Now, if I, as a federal judge, determine that your legal standing in this matter is contingent upon a broader interpretation of judicial ethics, do I not have the authority to impose penalties to uphold that integrity? The room tensed. He was invoking one of the most powerful Supreme Court precedents in American history, the very ruling that granted courts the ability to strike down unconstitutional laws. By doing so, he was suggesting that his own interpretation of judicial ethics gave him the right to fine her. Usha Vance exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to shake her head. It was an audacious move, but one she had anticipated. With respect, Your Honor, you are misapplying Marbury, she said, her voice unwavering. Judicial review grants the courts the power to interpret laws, not to create them. You are effectively proposing a new judicial power, the ability to levy fines outside the scope of existing statutes. That is not judicial review. That is judicial legislation, and it directly violates the doctrine of separation of powers. Judge Carter's smirk widened as though he had expected nothing less. Clever, he admitted. But let me ask you this, if the Supreme Court has ruled in multiple cases that judges may interpret laws in ways not explicitly written, how do we draw the line between interpretation and creation? Usha's heart pounded, not from nerves but from the sheer thrill of the argument. The line, Your Honor, is drawn by precedent. Interpretation must always be grounded in existing legal principles. If a judge's ruling cannot be traced to a direct legal foundation, then it ceases to be interpretation and becomes invention. She turned slightly, addressing the courtroom. This is the very reason why courts rely on stare decisis to ensure that our legal system remains consistent and predictable. If judges were allowed to impose arbitrary fines under the guise of interpretation, then judicial power would have no limits. The room was dead silent. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, too absorbed in the argument unfolding before them. Judge Carter studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Well played, Mrs. Vance. A pause. Then he reached for his gavel and said, I have no choice but to rule in favor of the defendant. A wave of gasps erupted in the courtroom. The fine was overturned. Usha Vance had won. But before the noise could swell, Judge Carter raised his hand. Let it be known, he said, that this was not a case of punishment. This was a case of principle. The true purpose of this hearing was to determine if one of America's greatest legal minds could defend herself under the highest level of scrutiny. He turned back to Usha, his expression one of profound respect. And she has. The room exploded into applause. Usha Vance had passed the test. But what she didn't yet realize was that this case had set a new precedent. One that would ripple across the legal landscape of America for years to come. As the gavel struck wood, the echoes of the ruling seemed to linger in the courtroom, carrying the weight of something far greater than a single legal victory. Usha Vance remained composed, her expression betraying none of the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had just defended herself against one of the most challenging legal arguments ever constructed and won. But she knew better than to bask in the moment. A win in court was never just a win. It was a ripple spreading through the legal community, shaping discussions and influencing cases for years to come. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. You see, Mrs. Vance, he said with something resembling admiration, this was never about the fine. It was about proving that the law is only as strong as those who defend it. And I needed to see if you were still willing to fight, not as the Vice President's wife, but as one of the sharpest legal minds in this country. Usha met his gaze, understanding the weight of what he was saying. And if I had failed? Then we would have all failed, Carter said simply. Because without people like you, the system crumbles. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as reporters rushed to file their stories. The news would spread quickly. Judge challenges Usha Vance in legal duel and loses. As Usha turned to leave, a young law student approached her hesitantly, clutching a notepad. Mrs. Vance, he stammered, I just wanted to say that was the most incredible argument I've ever witnessed. It was like watching Thurgood Marshall or Ruth Bader Ginsburg in their prime. Usha allowed herself a small smile. Thank you, she said warmly. But remember, the law isn't just about winning arguments. It's about making sure justice prevails, no matter the cost. The student nodded, looking like he had just received the most important lesson of his life. As Usha stepped outside, the cameras flashed and reporters fired questions in rapid succession. Mrs. Vance, how do you feel about today's ruling? Do you believe Judge Carter overstepped his authority? What does this mean for legal ethics going forward? She paused, considering her answer carefully. Then, with the same confidence she had carried into the courtroom, she spoke. Today was about something much bigger than me, she said. It was about proving that the law belongs to no one person, not a judge, not a lawyer, not even the Vice President's wife. It belongs to the people. And as long as we have the courage to challenge it, test it, and defend it, justice will always prevail. The cameras kept flashing, the world hanging on to her words. And as she walked away, Usha Vance knew that she hadn't just won a case. She had set a new standard for justice in America.